Some stories are told for entertainment, and some are told as warnings. What you are about to hear belongs to the second kind. This incident was shared by a man named Edward from the northern English town of Northheath. According to him, this terrifying event happened to his grandfather, Thomas Walker, many decades ago, and even in his old age, he could never speak about that night without fear returning to his eyes. Thomas used to say that the world feels different in lonely places. Sounds carry farther, shadows seem deeper, and silence itself begins to feel alive. Nearly 50 years ago, when he was just 20 years old, he joined the British Railway Service after finishing school. It was his first job, and although he felt proud, he had no idea that his first posting would place him in a location few people willingly stayed in. The station stood miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by empty fields and thick forest. During the day, it looked harmless, almost peaceful, but at night, it transformed into something else entirely. The wind would move through the trees like whispers, and the darkness felt heavy, as though it was watching. Thomas quickly realized why the previous station master had left without hesitation. He was the only permanent employee assigned there. The man he replaced handed over the keys with unusual urgency and left the same evening. Near the tracks stood an old stone church, abandoned except for occasional visitors on Sundays. Thomas often sat there alone after sunset, lighting a candle and praying quietly, trying to escape the crushing loneliness that came with the endless silence. Only 3 trains passed that line each day, and the final train arrived shortly before 11 at night. The station had no modern signal system, so Thomas manually closed the crossing gate before every arrival. Most nights passed without incident, yet the isolation slowly affected him. Weeks would go by without meaningful conversation, and the quiet began to feel unnatural rather than peaceful. One summer night, the air was unusually warm and still. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting pale silver light across the tracks. A thin mist rolled across the ground, blurring the edges of everything. Thomas waited for the final train, eager to finish his shift. The night felt wrong somehow, though he could not explain why. Even the insects had fallen strangely silent. At exactly 11, the distant whistle of the approaching train echoed through the valley. Relief washed over him as the headlights appeared in the distance. But seconds later, a sudden scream tore through the night, followed by the harsh grinding of metal. Sparks burst beneath the wheels as the train came to a violent stop just short of the crossing, shattering the stillness completely. Thomas grabbed his lantern and ran toward the engine, his heart pounding. What he found there froze him in place. A man had been struck by the train, his body horribly broken and scattered along the track. Several passengers stood nearby in shock, some unable to look. The driver, pale and trembling, insisted the man had stepped onto the track without warning, appearing almost out of nowhere. With help from a few passengers, the remains were gathered and placed beside the rails, covered respectfully with cloth. No one recognized the victim, and he carried nothing that could identify him. 2 police officers traveling on the train refused to remain behind, explaining the route was unsafe at night. Within minutes, the train departed, leaving Thomas alone with the body beneath the moonlight. The silence that followed felt suffocating. The sound of the departing train faded, replaced by distant wind and the faint rustling of grass. Thomas sat several feet away, trying to steady his nerves by quietly reciting passages from the Bible. He told himself morning would come soon, yet time seemed to slow, each minute stretching endlessly in the cold, empty night. As exhaustion set in, he began hearing faint noises that he could not explain. At first, it sounded like fabric moving across the ground. When he checked, the body remained still. He convinced himself it was only fear playing tricks on his mind. Still, a growing unease settled over him, as if something unseen was standing just beyond the edge of the lantern's light. Sometime after midnight, Thomas briefly fell asleep despite his efforts to stay awake. He woke suddenly to a strange dragging sound. When he looked toward the body, his breath caught in his throat. The remains had shifted several feet from where they had been placed. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, nothing to explain how it had moved across the ground. Before he could react, the upper half of the body twitched violently. Slowly, unnaturally, it pushed itself upright. The crushed head lifted, turning toward him with hollow, empty eyes. Terror overwhelmed him instantly. His body refused to move for a moment, trapped between disbelief and horror, until survival instinct finally took over and he ran toward the distant church. As he ran, he made the mistake of looking back. The sight behind him would haunt him forever. The body, missing its legs, was moving toward him, floating slightly above the ground. Its arms dragged through the air, pulling it forward with impossible speed. Realizing he would never reach the church in time, Thomas rushed into an abandoned farming shed and locked himself inside. Moments later, slow knocking began on the wooden door. It was not violent, but steady and deliberate, as if something outside knew he could not escape. Through cracks in the wood, Thomas saw long fingers scraping against the surface. A faint reddish glow seeped through the gaps, accompanied by low, unnatural groaning that sounded neither human nor animal. The knocking suddenly stopped, and silence returned. Then came footsteps above him. Something was walking across the roof. The scratching began again, louder this time, tearing into the weak wooden ceiling. Dust fell around him as the roof started to break apart. Certain he was about to die, Thomas fell to his knees and prayed desperately for protection. The ceiling collapsed, and the body dropped heavily onto the floor. It began dragging itself toward him, inch by inch. Trapped against the wall, Thomas noticed a wooden frame hanging nearby, displaying a sacred image and a passage of scripture. In desperation, he grabbed it and held it out in front of him. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The creature screamed and recoiled violently, its body convulsing as if burned by an unseen force. Within seconds, it collapsed into separate pieces once again. Thick black smoke poured from the remains, twisting upward through the broken roof. As distant church bells rang for morning prayer, the smoke vanished into the air, and the presence disappeared completely. When morning arrived, a local farmer found Thomas unconscious inside the shed. The deep claw marks on the door and the torn roof left everyone confused and unsettled. Yet when they returned to the tracks, the body lay exactly as it had before, untouched and silent, as if the night's horror had never happened at all. Thomas requested a transfer within days and never returned to that station again. Even decades later, he admitted he never understood what he encountered that night. He only believed that something dark had used the dead body as a vessel, and that faith alone had saved him. Until his final years, he avoided speaking of it, fearing that remembering might invite it back. Some say fear creates illusions, while others believe certain places remember death. What do you think really happened that night? Was it a spirit, something darker, or just a mind broken by isolation and fear? I want to know your theory. Write it in the comments. Because the strangest part of this story is that similar incidents were reported on abandoned tracks years later.